So people have started manipulating images as soon as they started taking pictures, be it Trotsky removed from this historical picture or a thousand general with his face pasted on a different horseman pasted on a different battlefield photo. And as soon as people started making digital photos, software for digital manipulation also blossomed. Earlier examples were um, collections of handcrafted image manipulation tools tailored to specific applications and requiring still a lot of skill. Later, attention shifted towards parametric simulations and fitting real data to the simulations. But as you can see, even for very simple closed domains like faces, it took 2 decades and millions of dollars to get to plausible results. And finally, neural models recently were shown to be able to manipulate diverse sets of properties quite well, but consequently, they required vast annotated datasets to achieve this high quality. And for some attributes, such as lighting conditions or reflectance or surface texture or surface shape, annotations are difficult to even express numerically, let alone annotate manually by human. So maybe instead of painstakingly annotating each single real image, we could find a similar data set or a simulation that already has this fine-grained control over individual attributes built into that data set and somehow transfer this knowledge on how to manipulate individual attributes across these two visually distinct domains. And one way people have been transferring knowledge across visual domains is by performing unsupervised image alignment, meaning finding some mapping T that makes two visual domains more similar. For example, we might extract some patches from images from these two domains and minimize some notion of distinguishability between distributions of these patches. Unfortunately, though, most practically useful and expressive ways of defining this distinguishability use neural networks, and as a result, and result in unstable training. And the ones that do not use neural networks are not as useful in higher dimensions, as it turns out. So the first topic that I wanted to discuss today is how we can probably get stable distribution alignment that at the same time makes use of expressive power and generalizability of modern neural networks in higher dimensions. But if we just blindly aligned images to in real and synthetic domains and found some good mapping between those domains and, for example, wanted to, let's say, manipulate the mouth expression of a person and translated that person to the synthetic domain, manipulated the mouse expression there and transferred it back, we would, of course, change the mouse expression correctly, but fail absolutely miserably in all other regards because all other aspects of that image have changed too. Which leads me to the second topic that I wanted to discuss today, which is using image alignment to transfer this precise control over individual attributes that we have in synthetic domains to the real domains in which to real domains in which we do not have any supervision, and currently we do not have any control over individual attributes whatsoever. More generally, though, if we look at factors of variability present in those two domains, synthetic supervision is, of course, possible only for factors that are present and varied in both domains. But um, what about those other attributes that are unique to each domain? For example, we, of course, cannot learn to manipulate hair color of, let's say, real people using synthetic data simply because synthetic people do not have hair color. But maybe we could still learn something useful from this domain pair. So, and the answer is yes, which leads me to the third topic that I wanted to discuss today, which is using alignment to disentangle and manipulate unique factors of each domain without any attribute supervision whatsoever, just by looking at these two sets of images. But before we dig deep into any of those topics, I would like to properly define the problem that we're solving. In the most simple one-to-one case, we can usually assume that there are two distributions of images, cats and dogs in this example, and then there is a single ground truth cross-domain mapping F that for any cat generates a dog, and if we apply it to all images of cats, we'll get all possible images of dogs. So to clarify, this exact picture correspondence that I show here is completely made up by me for illustration purposes, since we do not know the ground truth cat to dog mapping in real life. So according to this formalization, in the most simple one-to-one case, given independently drawn samples from these two distributions, our goal is to recover the original function f as good as possible. And usually we assume that the ground truth function not only generates realistic dogs, but also preserves the fur color, pose, and everything else as much as possible. And throughout this talk, I will also mention statistical distances between datasets or distributions. And what is important right now is that these are just some functions that take two sets as inputs and return large numbers for sets that look like that do not look like they come from the same distribution, and smaller numbers for sets that might have came from the same distribution. So for example, the distance between sample means is a statistical distance because it is smaller for the pair of sets on the right than for the pair of sets on the left, but probably not a very powerful one since it fails to differentiate distributions with different variances but same means, for example. Okay, so getting back to recovering f from unpaired samples, the way people typically approach this problem is by minimizing some kind of this statistical distance between transformed cat images and real dog images with some regularization term restricting possible mappings. So our hope is that even if we start from mapping f that generates nothing like dog images at step 0, eventually, by minimizing this loss, we will converge to generating plausible dog images while preserving semantics of the input. And different choices of statistical distances can cause different kinds of problems. First of all, our statistical distance might be too weak in a sense that it cannot detect that dog images are implausible. And as a result, our training will get just stuck at generating bad dog images. For example, if we approximated our data sets with Gaussians, and which is relatively easy to compute and then to align, to minimize, that would only align their first two moments and probably not result in very plausible dog images. On the other hand, some distances, especially non-parametric ones, are often so strong, so to speak, that they stay very high unless each of the generated dogs precisely matches one of the real dogs from the training set. These kinds of distances often do not take the structure of the dog domain into account and compare some sort of pairwise distances between images in pixel space, which stay very high even for correct images, because the image domain is just so high dimensional that we do not have enough samples to cover it densely enough for this pairwise distances to start making sense statistically speaking. Or we could define this distance as the loss of a classifier trained to minimize these classifier trained to discriminate between these two sets of images. And minimizing this objective will push points towards the decision boundary. And if we repeat this procedure multiple times until convergence, we should end up with cats that were turned into dogs that are indistinguishable from real dogs by the classifier family. Unfortunately, though, this type of alignment involves solving a min-max problem, and solving these kinds of problems with first-order methods is hard even for a simple toy problem illustrated here, let alone for complex objectives involving complex neural networks. So to sum up, non-parametric and simple parametric models, such as distances between Gaussians, are easy to optimize, but they fail to align complex distributions in higher dimensions, whereas adversarial methods learn to respect the structure of datasets correctly, but unfortunately result in min-max problems that are hard to solve and cause instability. Which leads me to the first of 5 papers that I'm going to discuss today, and this one is going to be pretty short. The second one is going to be a little longer, and the remaining 3 are also going to be quite short. So I'm sure we should fit into the time frame. In this work, we used objective dualization to stabilize the training of GANs by replacing the min-max objective with the dual minimization objective. Long story short, we performed this dualization trick on the likelihood of logistic classifier trained to discriminate two domains and got the following constraint minimization objective in place of the original maximization objective. We based the proof heavily on prior work, and there is nothing particularly interesting in it, the standard logistic classifier dualization proof. So I will skip it for now, but I can get back to it in the end if committee is interested in detail. So we went ahead and minimized the resulting dual objective, which is now simple minimization objective. And we got nice stable optimization as shown on the left, whereas the original min-max training caused the decision boundary to spin around the optimum and never really converge to anything, as shown on the right. And if we use kernelization, we also got nice nonlinear alignment. Unfortunately, despite being very stable, the resulting procedure requires the classifier to be a simple logistic one that again puts a fairly strong constraint over the kinds of distributions that we can align using this method. Which leads me to the second paper that I was hoping to discuss throughout this talk, in which we show how you can get a very powerful and stable at the same alignment using normalizing flows. Okay, so more specifically, compared to prior work, in this work, we show that we can use any tractable density model as a data model. So it's a huge upgrade compared to dualization paper or to those simple parametric models. And we still get a simple closed form objective that we can minimize with any flavor of gradient descent you prefer. So we start by assuming that we have two data sets, gray A and orange B, that we want to align, meaning to find some transformation T of X that makes them indistinguishable. More specifically, we assume that there is a fixed parametric density family M that we want the transformed data set T of A and B to be indistinguishable from the point of view of that density family. For example, for a Gaussian family, any two data sets that have same means and variances are effectively indistinguishable. It won't look at anything else other than, but the Gaussian family does not look at things other than mean and variances. So if they are same from the point of view of this Gaussian family. And we want a similar notion of the indistinguishability, but not just for Gaussians, for arbitrary families of densities. Okay, so what we do is we first feed two density models, theta A and theta B, to those data sets. And fitting here means essentially pushing those points up as much as possible while keeping the integral under the curve integrate to 1. And we also assume that we can fit a density model with parameters theta AT to a transformed distribution T of A. So we had the original distribution, we transformed it with a function T, and now we have T of A, and we fit another density to that. And we now feed the fourth density, so that we call shared distribution, theta S, to a combined data set containing both T of A and B. Okay, so we mix those two data sets and fit another density to them, to a mixture of those, and it is drawn in purple here. And the key observation is that the likelihoods of private models, those green and orange ones, will always be higher than the likelihood of the shared purple model, right? Because the shared model has a harder task of approximating two distributions. Its likelihood, the amount of likelihood that it assigns to each of them will be higher, will be lower. So the purple curve will always be lower than the green and the orange one, unless orange and green distributions are aligned and indistinguishable and effectively the same data set from the point of view of the density family M. And in this case, the likelihoods will be same, both for fitting a model to T of A, or to fitting it to B, or to fitting to a mixture of those. There will be no difference for the in terms of the density that we get. So we can define the likelihood ratio distance as the size of this gap that goes to 0 as distributions become more similar. So this is our way of measuring how far the distributions are. If you feed a density to each of them, and then to a mixture of them, and you get the same density, you're good. The same average likelihood. But if we approached minimizing this distance directly, the resulting problem would still be adversarial. So it seems like we have not gained much. Here, I need to make a quick digression to explain what normalizing flows are. So let's say we have some distribution P of X, and we have some transformation T that shifts it by a constant. Of course, density would not change in this case at all. But if we divided our random variable by the factor of 2, its support would shrink by the factor of 2. And at the same time, the probability density would increase by the same factor of 2 to keep the area under the curve still integrate to 1, right? But more generally, if we have some transformation T and we apply it to our random variable x, then each local neighborhood of x would get stretched by the factor proportional to the derivative of t at each point, and the density would also change proportionally to that. And many of you have probably recognized that this is essentially a change of variable formula that I'm explaining just visually. And in the context of this talk, normalizing flows are just some kind of neural network architecture for which this change of variable computation can be performed computationally efficiently. And therefore, if we apply this neural network to some known distribution, then we can compute the density of the transformed distribution at any point exactly and efficiently. So normalizing flows are the types of neural networks that if we apply them to the gray curve, you know the green curve exactly. That's that's their key advantage. They are constrained and built in a way that allows doing that. So our second observation is that the green curve that corresponds to the likelihood of the model theta AT can be estimated in closed form and exactly from the gray curve that corresponds to the likelihood of theta A if T is a normalizing flow, only in this case. Which leads us to the main contribution made in this paper, showing that we can minimize the adversarial likelihood ratio distance, the adversarial objective that I defined before, the distance between those heights of those curves, by minimizing a non-adversarial LRMF objective that I show below. And the proof is, we prove a slightly more technical version of that because we also take into account the fact that it could be that after the transformation, the density is so weird that we cannot approximate it anymore, and several other edge cases. But fundamentally, yeah, this is the term that takes care of that. But fundamentally, the proof is just applying this change of variable formula and then taking care of all those weird edge cases. So I will not really focus on that a lot. It's just factoring out all other things factoring out that error that comes from the fact that the class of densities might have changed after the transformation. And it all factors out into like a constant error factor that we ignore if our density class is rich enough. But intuitively, what this objective does is it extends the green density as much as possible while squeezing the purple density around green and orange densities as much as possible. And the math works out in a way that the equilibrium is precisely when those distributions are aligned. And then it reaches precisely zero. The math works out that way. And if we run experiments with this objective, aligning the red distribution with blue distributions here using this normalizing flow objective, first, and some other existing objective, first we see that it works, meaning that things are getting aligned as expected. Second, it preserves both the local and the global structure of aligned data sets much better than the alternatives. And the third, the objective on the bottom, the bottom row, it smoothly decreases over time and reaches zero precisely when data sets are aligned, which seems nice. Like we have reached our goal. We now can align distributions with using any density families as discriminators. There are some important special cases. For example, if we pick Gaussians as a density family M, that unsurprisingly, we get moment matching objective. We also showed its relation to Jensen-Shannon divergence, and that we showed that minimizing our objective is equivalent to performing adversarial training with a particular discriminator family, which is somewhat surprising because it shows that there is an equivalent discriminator, but training is still stable. How can that be? And the intuition here is that since we know the distribution of T of A and B, as I showed before, we know the distribution of T of A because we know the distribution of A and T is a normalizing flow. We can just compute the optimal Bayesian classifier in closed form and just plug it right into the GAN objective. So the proposed objective does not involve a min-max anymore. because the optimal classifier is just defined in closed form, and you just plug it in there instead of learning it every time. We applied it to some digits, real data sets, and while it did something reasonable in the embedding space of a VA again, when we applied to pixel space using a modern convolutional normalizing flow called GLOW, it did something, but the objective never fully converged to 0, no matter how long we trained it, indicating some kind of failure mode. So we went back to the blackboard and tried to figure out the simplest case in which this failure mode takes place, and came up with the following illustrating example. So
Do
if
you
we
mind,
have two identities,
repeating the failure mode again, please?
yep. So when we took a more complicated, so when we tried to align things in the embedding space of another model, things worked out the way we expected. But when we took a really complex normalizing flow and tried to apply it in pixel space, which is ideally the ultimate application. You have complicated density model that you apply just in pixel space, and it aligns things in pixel space. It didn't work. And we know that it didn't work because the objective, mathematically, we know that it should converge to 0 when things are aligned, but it never did. No matter how hard we tried, how we tweaked things, it never converged to 0. It always stuck at fairly high values.
Got it. Thank you.
So we went back to the blackboard and tried to figure out the simplest case where we can see this failure mode again. And we figured this illustrating example. So let's say we have two data sets, orange and gray. And they're both generated by mixtures of Gaussians. And we do the standard procedure. We get some likelihoods. We combine them into the objective. And if we shift our left density by a little bit to the right, we can see that none of the densities, none of the likelihoods of any models have changed, despite things being somewhat closer to the correct solution, which means that the objective did not change either at all. Like things became closer to how they should be, but the objective did not change even a little bit. And when we write it out, mathematically, it turns out that the derivative of our objective with respect to this shifting parameter decays really, really quickly. So if distributions become far enough, the gradients are just so low amplitude that it never converges. So it's essentially vanishing of generator gradients, the same problem that happens in GANs. If you train GAN too long, your discriminator becomes so confident that it does not give any useful signal to the generator anymore. So we see the same problem. Here, so to sum up, we can update the table that we had before. Now we have an objective that aligns distributions using any tractable density models. It yields stable iterations and does not suffer from mode collapse, but it still suffers from vanishing generator gradients, just like GANs. So probably there needs to be more work done in order to get it to actually our ultimate goal of stably aligning distributions using a single objective. Which leads me to the next paper that I wanted to discuss. And the disclaimer is that I'm the second author on this paper compared to other papers that I discuss in this presentation, and I'm including it mostly because I use it in other two works that I discuss. That's why I need to explain what I'm doing. And my contribution was mostly technical in this paper. So the problem that we are addressing with this paper is that even if our statistical distance is low, the learned mapping might still be just completely nonsensical. And in a seminal paper of Zhu, they showed that if you they proposed so-called cycle loss and showed that it improves the semantic quality of the alignment. And the idea is quite straightforward. If you map an image from one domain to another and then map it back, you should get the same exact picture. And it should prevent the network from generating completely unrelated images, since it would be difficult to reconstruct the image back from a completely unrelated image. And in this paper, we applied several models that use the cycle loss to unpaired examples of images and segmentations to get some kind of unsupervised segmentation network. And we noticed that they managed to reconstruct that these networks managed to reconstruct all aspects of input images, such as colors and the location of the glare and all of that perfectly, despite the fact that these details should have been lost during translation into the segmentation domain, since segmentations do not specify what colors are and where the lighting is. And if we add a little bit of noise to generated segmentations before reconstruction, then the reconstruction breaks completely, suggesting that the segmentation to real network actually relies on some kind of hidden signal to reconstruct the image instead of relying on generated semantic segmentation. Turns out that the same effect was also discovered independently by Chu and others a year before, but we went one step further than them, and we proposed two defense techniques that prevent this kind of cheating. And we show that preventing the model from performing this adversarial attack actually improves the translation quality. So the first one is just adding noise to segmentations before reconstructions, simply to destroy any adversarial signal that could be there with random noise, and it helps a bit. And the second one is works a little better, but it's a little more involved, so we'll describe it quickly now. So as we said, let's say we know that the network G A to B maps real images to segmentations and always adds this adversarial noise that helps it to reconstruct images perfectly. And here I exaggerate this noise, of course, just for visualization. The key observation is that if we take another real segmentation, map it to the real domain, and then back to the segmentation domain to get cycle reconstruction, that cycle reconstruction would look almost identical to the original, but will contain that adversarial noise because it was generated using that network GA to B that we know always adds adversarial noise. So now we have B and B cycle that are identical, but B cycle contains adversarial noise. So if we do that for many segmentation maps and collect a data set of such pairs of segmentations with and without adversarial noise, now we can train a detector of that noise and penalize the model for adding that noise. So that's what we do. And we measure several things like sensitivity to quantization of those segmentations and to noise, and some proxy for the quality of the generated images of the layout of the generated images. And the proposed techniques indeed improve everything across all metrics on multiple data sets, including, surprisingly, even data sets where that are one-to-one, and therefore there was no embedding even necessary, but CycleGuns seemed to embed things anyway, even in this case. So in this section, we saw that if we prevent cycle model from cheating by hiding adversarial noise in generated images, we can get a much more semantically consistent alignment, which leads me to the next paper that I wanted to discuss. And in this paper, we show how to train a network to manipulate a single specific attribute of a real image using only synthetic supervision. So for example, the proposed method can manipulate mouth expression or lighting direction of a real face using only synthetic examples of how to do that. And this results in a model that during training takes synthetic triplets, such as the one on the top, as supervision. And during inference, it can take real faces, synthetic reference for, let's say, mouth expression in this case, and modify only the mouth expression in the input real image. The same applies to lighting here. We give it examples of how to modify lighting on a synthetic image, and it learns how to modify lighting on real images, preserving identity and facial expression of the original and everything else. And it's not limited to faces in any way. Here we showed examples of how to manipulate rotations of synthetic type digits, and it transfers this knowledge on how to manipulate real handwritten digits, rotations of real handwritten digits. Here we applied, can you see the video? It's a little weird.
Yeah.
Okay, oh yes, perfect. Here we applied the mouth open and mouth closed manipulation to very tight crops of faces from those videos on purpose, just to show that even without any stitching or we could get better results if we applied stitching or if we took larger crops. But here on purpose, we took very tight crops to show that even in this case, you almost cannot notice the border, the place where one is aligned with, is stitches with the other, meaning that we indeed only change the mouse and almost do not change anything else. So I will briefly mention losses that we used in this paper, but fundamentally we trained a model with a shared encoder and two domain-specific decoders that split embedding into two parts: the attribute that we want to manipulate and everything else. This way, we can manipulate the image by taking a mouth embedding from a synthetic image um, and everything else embedding from the real image and passing them to the real image decoder. We first use some standard reconstruction cycle losses to ensure that each attribute of input image is indeed at least encoded somewhere, either in the purple or the green embedding. And we also used adversarial losses to enforce interchangeability of those embeddings, essentially enforcing realism of all outputs regardless of whether the embedding is extracted from real or synthetic faces, and enforced explicit pixel supervision in the synthetic domain using available triplets. Since we know that combining mouth from B1 and everything else from B2 should result in exactly B3, we enforce it explicitly. With losses I outlined before, the synthetic decoder, of course, must use both of its inputs in order to, sorry, um, to generate correct output, but the real decoder might learn to just copy its left input and ignore its right input altogether, ignoring the synthetic input because we do not really have any supervision on real data and we only use realism losses. And to combat that, we propose some additional losses that ensure that the real decoder must use both of its inputs. Basically, the first loss is constructed in a way that makes it impossible to satisfy unless the decoder uses its right input, because without it, there would be no way of knowing how exactly the mouth needs to be modified. And the second one ensures that the real decoder must use its left input in a similar way. I won't go into details, but the idea is that without that, all that information is erased before, so it needs to use its left input in order to generate the image correctly. And there weren't really any methods for a direct comparison at the time for this task, so we compared two methods that solve somewhat compatible problems data-wise, and none of them was able to get any close to solving this problem, and we showed that quantitatively as well. So the takeaway message of this section is that with a little bit of disentanglement trickery, image alignment can indeed make it possible to transfer precise control over attributes that we have in the synthetic domain onto the real domain without any additional supervision on the real domain, which in my opinion is quite exciting. And I will mention some possible applications of this research in the end of the presentation. So moving on to the last paper that I wanted to discuss today. OK, so I would like to start by noticing that the problem of learning a one-to-one semantically meaningful alignment between male and female faces is actually not a very well-defined problem in the sense of having a single correct solution, since there is nothing in the semantics of a female image that should specify whether the generated male image should or should not have a beard. One way to resolve this ambiguity is to alter the problem definition and map pairs of female and male images into the male domain, using the male input only to specify whether the output should or should not have a beard. This way, the problem is well defined. We take everything that we can from a female image, and whatever is just not present in the female domain, we take from the male image, let's say a beard. And the resulting problem is an instance of a so-called unsupervised many-to-many alignment problem. And more generally, if we have a pair of data sets that we want to align, according to our updated task definition, our model needs to first learn which factors of variation are specific to each domain and which are shared just from data. And in this case, skin tone, pose, and background color are varied in both domains, so they're shared, whereas presence of the facial hair is varied only in males, so it is male-specific factor of variation, whereas we built this data set so that hair color is varied only in the female domain, so it is female-specific. And on the other domain pairs, the split can be completely different depending on what is shared and what is specific in each dataset, and it depends on the dataset. Moreover, our model has to learn how to map images into another domain while preserving shared factors of the source image and applying domain-specific factors of the guide image. In this case, it has to preserve the skin color, pose, and the background of the source and apply the hair color of the guide. Several methods were proposed for this task already, but as you can see, StyleGAN v2, for example, incorrectly attributes background as domain-specific factor and changes it to match the guide, whereas our method correctly recognizes it as shared since background is varied in both domains, so it should be preserved. On the shapes dataset, for example, munit changes the object color, even though it is shared and should be preserved, whereas our method does everything correctly. And more generally, even on this simple shapes dataset I have shown on the previous slide, none of prior methods were able to correctly infer which factors are domain-specific and shared if you compare them to the ground truth column on the right. And our method is the first one to actually do that correctly, more or less. This is likely because prior methods were mostly evaluated in terms of realism of generated images and diversity of their outputs, and were never really properly evaluated in terms of correctness of their outputs. One reason for most of these methods failing is that they use ada-in to change domain-specific attributes, and as a result, these methods change all textures and colors of the input, even if textures and colors are shared and should be preserved. So it works in some cases where colors and textures should be changed, but it does not work correctly when they should be preserved. On a high level, we expect our method to take the source image, combine it with a domain-specific embedding of the guide image to generate plausible image from another domain that should have the same shared attributes as the source image, meaning same orientation and same background as the source input in this case. Then we expect the network to reconstruct this image back from the generated female image to satisfy cycle reconstruction loss. And the key observation here is that since females never have the variability in the beard, it should not be really able to do that because it would have no knowledge of whether the reconstruction should or should not have a beard, right? Therefore, it has to use this additional domain-specific embedding to encode this information about the beard because it cannot get it from the female. Unfortunately, though, as I showed in one of the previous slides, cycle consistent model tends to force the model to hide information necessary for cycle reconstruction inside of generated images. And in our case, that would correspond to hiding mustaches inside of generated female images instead of storing it in that domain-specific embedding. And to prevent that, we add that same honesty loss, which I explained in one of the previous slides. Moreover, in order to prevent the model from storing all the details of the source image inside that domain-specific embedding and generating completely arbitrary female image that has nothing to do with the input male image, we put an additional constraint on the capacity of that domain-specific embedding. And I will describe it in slightly more details in the next couple of slides. So for the loss constraining the amount of information stored in the domain-specific embedding, and we need that because otherwise it would just put all the information into that embedding and generate a random female instead because it can. Turned out that if we just penalize the L2 norm of these embeddings and add Gaussian noise of fixed amplitudes to it before using it for reconstruction, this alone constrains the amount of information about the input that the network can theoretically use to generate the cycle reconstruction A prime. And we provide a theoretical bound over this quantity. And as you can see from the bound, if we disable the penalty on the norms and allow this term L to grow uncontrollably, or if we reduce the noise amplitude sigma to 0, in either of these two cases, the effective capacity goes to infinity, which makes sense intuitively, since in either of those two cases, it would correspond to just disabling the loss altogether, the capacity constraint. The bound itself can be interpreted as the logarithm of the number of embeddings that we can reliably distinguish from each other, given that they all live in that ball of radius L, and that each of them is perturbed randomly by the noise of amplitude sigma. So there is a limited number of them that we can distinguish, and this is essentially what this amount of information tells us about. The proof is also quite technical. It just uses the it's quite technical. I'll skip it. If the committee wants, I can go back to it after the end of the presentation. So as for the honesty loss, here the story is the same as with adversarial defense paper, since we know that the network M male to female always hides something, the mustache, for example, in generated images. We can collect pairs of original female images and female images, cycle reconstructed female images with something with mustache hidden inside them, and train an additional discriminator to detect just that and to use it to penalize hiding that information inside generated images. Okay, so we evaluated our method across 3 splits of 3D shapes with different domain-specific and shared factors, just to show which methods can adapt to changes, like this factor was domain-specific and now it's shared, or vice versa. A synthetic synaction dataset, and a particular split of Celebi dataset that was proposed in prior work. On the shapes dataset, it works almost perfectly. In few rare cases, it confused some shapes, but otherwise correctly preserved both the shared attributes, the object color and the shape, and applied correct orientation and size on the left and correct floor and wall color on the right, because those are specific factors of variability of those domains. On this other split, it did everything almost perfectly, but if you look closely, it incorrectly treats size as guide, even though it should be preserved since it's varied in both datasets. And this kind of shows why prior methods really, people thought that they work really well, but if you look closely, you notice that they do not, because even here, it looks like everything is done correctly, but if you look closely and look at each individual attribute in isolation, you start noticing errors when you take into account which vectors are shared and which are domain specific. And on this split, it did everything correctly on the third split. On synaction, which is, by the way, matches the inductive bias of those add-in methods, since you should change all the colors and all the textures here. So it's the kind of best scenario for those methods. We performed almost as good with very few errors and as good as those methods on the left in that direction, and almost without any errors on the right direction, in the other direction. And on Celebi, only our method and did correctly preserve the background of each image and vary it because it is varied in both datasets, and therefore it should be preserved, and apply the hair color and the mustache of the guide in corresponding domains. We evaluated all of that quantitatively, and it agrees with what I just said. And moreover, our method not only has highest average manipulation accuracy, but both runner-ups, StarGAN and DID, performed really well on some datasets, but performed really poorly on other datasets, whereas we are either best or second best across all datasets. But unfortunately, there are still a lot of unresolved challenges. The first one is that some attributes occupy and affect a very different number of pixels and therefore affect reconstruction losses with very different effective weight. And the second, much more fundamental, is that in many real-world datasets, some factors might be varied in both domains, but have very different distributions of these factors. So for example, if in female domains we have 3% of blondes, but in the male domain we have 50% of blondes, should we treat the hair color as a shared or domain-specific attribute? And if we treat it as shared and preserve it, does it mean that we have to sacrifice the realism of the male domain? Because right now there will be only 3% of blonde males, whereas it should be 50. Or should we treat it as domain specific? But if we do, then what is the threshold? If the difference is like not 3 to 50, but like 60 to 50, should we still do that? Where is the threshold? These are all open questions, and we do not really have answers to them, and we should find what we think are the right answers to those questions before we can proceed and build and apply those models to real data sets. So the takeaway message here is that some constraints and defenses I described, with them, the domain alignment can be used to discover domain-specific factors from unpaired examples without any additional supervision. And in the couple remaining minutes, I will mention a couple of applications that I think are exciting, possible applications of these methods. For example, we might have a model trained to perform, let's say, motion recognition. And we would like to test how sensitive it is to, let's say, mouth openness in isolation from all other attributes and not to worry about weird effects like Simpson's paradox. Well, the good news is that since it's relatively easy to simulate this attribute manipulation on synthetic data, we can very easily train a puppet GAN and see the effect of this manipulation on the output of the model directly in isolation from all other attributes. Another possible scenario where this research can be useful is if we train a downstream model on some data, and now we received some test data, and realize that there could be some factors of variation present in the test that are simply not present in the training data, and vice versa. And we would like to check whether our model happens to be sensitive to those factors of variation that are missing in our training data but present in the test data, because ideally, probably it should not. Like we expect to have everything that is important in the train. So whatever is test-specific degrees of variability, they should not really affect the output of the model. And the problem is that we do not really know what those factors are, but thankfully, if we apply our model Rift, we can easily answer those questions. The way I explained before, we could vary those test-specific attributes. And the final exciting application is aligning real, is if we have real data sets. And for real data set, we do not really know what are meaningful degrees of variability or how to model them. But maybe we can apply something like LRMF with something that makes it a stable and good way of aligning distributions. Apply it to some synthetic domain where we know what are meaningful and semantically and distinct degrees of variability, like size of objects, their shapes, and their locations. Then we could apply something like Rift to figure out what are the factors of variation that our simulation does not really reflect, like textures or lighting in this case. And with that knowledge, because we know we can disentangle, using those simulations, we can disentangle those meaningful factors in the real data. Now we can start building, like trying to understand how the reality works, basically. Now we have meaningful, semantically meaningful degrees of variability of the real world that we got from a simulation. And now we can start learning the rules of how the world works, like making some differential equations of how the shape and the size varies over time as a function of something else. Okay, so that is all the papers that I wanted to discuss today. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was interesting.